Today we're going to talk about foot position and squatting. We're going to talk about it in two parts. So we're going to look at the angle of the foot. Should we be straight? Should we have toes out? And then also we're going to talk about how far apart they should be. So should we have a narrow stance? Should we have a wide stance? And then we can start to put that together. Should it be wide and toes out? Should it be wide and feet parallel? If you want to improve your squat, if you want to improve your deadlift, or you just want greater hip range of movement, just click the link below. Go through to my how to improve hip mobility workshop, which is a 2-hour workshop where you come to the gym with me. We talk through, go through consultation and assessment. So talk through what you want to gain from the sessions. Then we go through, assess the hips, see where they are, and then we can put the two together and start building a plan to mobilize the hips for whatever goal it may be, to squat, to deadlift, or just for everyday life. First of all, let's talk about the angle of the feet. So there's a lot of talk of, should we have feet parallel? Should we come out a touch, or should we go really wide? We're going to start off with talking about muscle activation. So that's kind of like point number one. When we come into this neutral feet parallel, part of squatting and a part of deadlifting and a part of hip hinging in general is when we go into flexion. So when we go into this position, when we go into flexion, we also want to externally rotate, because what that's doing is activating the muscles of the hip, and that's supporting the pelvis, and it's also supporting the torso and the spine that's above it. What you will also get is you will get a degree of support at the knees, at the ankle, and at the foot, because it will maintain arches, so muscle activation all the way up the chain when you're in that parallel position. Obviously, the thing that comes along with that is you need greater range of movement. And that's the reason why a lot of people come further out, is because they don't have the range of movement, and then this compensates for that lack of range of movement. So I'm very much in the camp of, we need to get the range of movement and then come into this position. But what I will say is that I'm happy for a sort of degree of a 15-degree angle to the feet. Obviously, it's not going to be an exact science, but we can have a little bit of an outturn depending on certain genetic factors of the way the knee joint or the way the hip joint is structured. The second thing is, if we start with a parallel stance, what we get, or what we need, I should say, is greater range of movement at the ankle, at the hip, and at the thoracic spine. Because if we take a weight, to be able to get down, we need to have the knees forward, we need to have good hip flexion and external rotation, and then the final one is being able to keep the chest up as well. So we need to have that extra bit of extension at the thoracic spine. If we come into this position, or if we come into this position, so we exaggerate it, then number one, these muscles shut off. So when we talked about muscle activation, we don't really get that, because we've already mechanically put it into the position. So they're not working as they could be working. If we go here and drive them out, you can feel it. The muscles come on. If we go here, they're sort of on, but they're not really on, if that makes sense. So when we come into this sort of parallel position, we get the muscle activation, as I've mentioned, but we require good health of the joints. So it's starting to bring in other factors. If we haven't got those range of movements, as I mentioned before, we get compensations. So if we come out here, what generally happens is it's because we don't have ankle range of movement. But in order to get ourselves down, we collapse the foot and go into that position. So I've now got a collapsed arch. I've got the outside of my foot that isn't working. I've got a knee that's collapsed in, that's on the inside of my foot. So again, none of this is in mechanically advantageous position. We've got lateral shears going through the inside of the knee. We've got glute muscles that aren't firing properly. So we've got all these different bits that aren't working if we go too far out. If we can get all the way out with the knees, then that's great, but it's much easier when we come into that position and down. So not only do we get muscle activation, we also get, or if we It also encourages us to have greater range of movement at the ankle, the hip, and the thoracic spine. And finally, as I've mentioned, toes out, which is that position, encourages all those positions that I've talked about. So when we come down, to be able to get down, we could do that, but it's much easier to lose the arch of the foot, to have the valgus knee. Now, there are some people out there that say we need to train the valgus knee, or we need to do this, or we need to do that. If we haven't got this as the fundamental position, then that is going to be a problem. If we've got this as the fundamental position, then that isn't going to be as bad, because we know we've got good integrity of the ankle. We know we can activate the muscles of the hip when we need to, because we've trained that as a foundation. So we need this as the foundation, and then all these other positions that might include in certain sports, then they become less of a problem, and we can train those types of positions. So again, we have to understand that as a concept. The fundamental position is the foot parallel, getting the range of movement, and then we can layer on top whatever we want, valgus knee. But when you look at valgus knee, or certainly positions with valgus knee, they're not technically valgus like that. It's more that they're like that. So they're internally rotated rather than valgus, if that makes sense. So those are some of the concepts that we have to understand, is are we really creating a valgus knee, or are we creating an internally rotated hip when it comes to sporting movements? Now we're talking about width or foot width. How far apart should we have our feet? So I'm going to say, with regards to the position of the feet, they need to be neutral or sort of just out 15%, so we can get good muscle activation. It should encourage us to have good hip range of movement, ankle and thoracic spine range of movement, and we avoid all the stresses on the joints. So that's sort of the first part to it. The second part is how far apart should they be. So this can come down to a number of things, but we're going to talk about limb length, hip structure, and muscle tension. The first one being limb length. Now, people who have shorter limb length, so they have shorter levers, are generally better at squatting because they can keep their centre of gravity over their heels, which is what the body's looking to do. If you've got longer limbs, it's much harder, because if you've got big long limbs, your centre of gravity, as soon as you take the hips back, your centre of gravity is going to go back, and that's going to offset all the muscles. Obviously, to counter that, if you've got good ankle range of movement, as you go back, you should be able to get your knees forward, and that keeps your centre of gravity forward. So we've got all these different things that need to be brought together. If we then move on to number 2, which would be hip structure, some people's sockets will be deeper, some will be more shallow. Some will also be more to the side of the pelvis. Some might be pointing slightly forwards in the pelvis. So these structures are going to influence the muscles, which is then going to influence how we're able to squat and how far down we're able to go. And then finally is the mobility. So we come down, and if we want to get the knees out, we're going to need good external rotation, good length through the adductors, through the psoas, to be able to get down into that hip flexion. So we need all these different types of things to be able to get that foot position. Now, with that said, there's a very simple exercise that you may have seen Dr. McGill do, or various other people who have taken it, and I'm now going to take that little exercise to help you understand where is a more advantageous. It's not an exact science, but it will certainly help you understand. And it's where we come down onto all fours, and then we come into this position, and then basically we get into the neutral spine, and then we go into hip flexion, and then you can start to feel when the back wants to round. And then basically what we're looking for, we come a little bit wider, we're looking for what's the optimal position to be able, there we go, that's for me to get down there. What I may find, if I go too wide, now I can start to feel, just can't get down because of the tension. But if I come into that middle position, I've got the range of movement and I've got the depth. Obviously, if I come too narrow, I can't get the depth, because I start rounding about there. So you can use that, and then all you're basically doing is you're saying, right, if I can get, that's my optimal, so I just need my feet that far apart. Obviously, you're not using the ankles, so the ankles are going to have their influence on that, whether you've got good range of movement or not. But that would be my optimal position of the feet. And then if I'm parallel, I've then got my feet in the best position. And then what I can do is if I go down and I still can't get down there, I look to the mobility and the muscle tension around my hip, around my ankle, around my thoracic spine, whatever it may be, to be able to get me down there. So it's about understanding all these different influences that are going to help me improve my squat or just improve my hip mobility in general. So as a summary, which I've started already a bit earlier, number one is feet forward or sort of 15 degrees out, but essentially feet forward. So we can get all the muscle activation. It encourages the range of movement. The second thing is finding your optimal foot position, which again is probably about here for me. If I go too narrow, I flex too early, but if I go too wide, I don't have the hip mobility to be able to get down as far as I want to get down because I can feel the tension through the inside of the leg. So number one, feet forward. Number two, find the optimal position. Once you've found the optimal position, it's then noticing the muscle tension or the restrictions in range of movement and then sorting those out accordingly, so whether it's hip, whether it's ankle, whether it's thoracic spine. And then finally, we can add any sport specific, which might be the valgus knee, or what I would describe as an internal rotation of the hip, which isn't a valgus knee, but it's then layering that on top. Because again, if we've got this as the fundamental position, then we layer all the different types of position on top. So as a summary, feet forward, find the optimal position, sort out mobility as necessary or accordingly, and then layering sport-specific movements on top. Hopefully that's been helpful. Hopefully it's given you an idea. If you want to come to the gym, work with me, sort your squat out, sort your deadlift out, or just in general sort your hips out, click the link below and I'll get you booked in.